My name is Carrie Giudice. I am the CPS Research and Policy Analyst at TexProtects. For those of you that don't know me, I actually started at TexProtects in January of this year. However, I do want to go ahead and tell you that my background with CPS starts before that. I actually worked for the department for about 8 years. I actually was a caseworker in the field for about 5 years. I worked with families whose children were in the custody of the state. And then for about 3 years, I worked a little bit more behind the scenes. I actually was a placement coordinator. So I worked with child placing agencies and some emergency shelters, and I really just tried to find the best fit for kiddos. I just am curious. So by a raise of hand, I know we're not in a room together. I'm just curious, at any point in your career, maybe that was this week, maybe it was when you started. I'm just curious, have you ever thought, I just don't know how this system works? Raise your hand. So I'm scrolling in this participant list, and what I'm seeing is I literally think I see something next to everybody's name. It's what I thought I might see, but wasn't totally sure. So I'm going to lower everybody's hands here. Thank you for participating in that. I know it's kind of weird to do that from your office or your home. But you know, the thing is I mean, I shared with you guys that I've worked in the system. And if you've ever engaged in a conversation with me, you've probably heard me say that the system is a beast. There's just so many different parts of the system. There's so many moving parts. There's just so many different things that can happen and so many different ways it can turn out. And so it's a beast. And so you're in good company on this webinar. So obviously there's several of you that feel the same way. And so my hope is that by these flowcharts, by this conversation today, that we can kind of demystify at least a little bit for you this system. All right. So I also wanted to just kind of talk a little bit about these flowcharts and just a little bit of the purpose behind them and kind of what went into the development of them. So for those who plan to work in this system and who want to make a difference, we must take it, you know, make it more accessible, and we must try to understand it. We have to make it more understandable. Again, it's a beast of a system. And so in doing that, we really wanted to make these more digestible. And so what you're going to see today is we actually have them in 5 parts. So we have what we kind of call an overview, which is like how the CPS system works. And then we have them in 4 different stages of service: investigations, family-based safety services, alternative response, and conservatorship. And so the ultimate goal for these is what we really want is for legislative offices, policymakers, advocates, providers. What we really want is for you to feel like you can understand this system and how it works. And what we hope is that you use these as a tool. So we also know that it's really important that you understand the system in the right way, right? And so we really want policymakers and lawmakers to understand it, and we want people to understand the different decision points, and we want people to know how thorough the department is in each of those systems, in each of those different stages of service. So when we were trying to kind of figure out what we were going to capture in each of these flowcharts, you know, a lot was taken into consideration. I really wanted to use my own personal experience within the system, but also we had looked into the CPS handbooks. We also looked into statute and rule. We also worked collaboratively with our partners and asked them to review them. And we also asked the department to review them. We really wanted them to be accurate. But I also want to point out that we could not possibly capture every little detail. And honestly, we didn't want to either, because that could be really overwhelming. But we really wanted to show kind of the typical flow of a case through the system, from when it comes in as a report through a case. And so today, what I really want to do is kind of highlight what I hope you will take away from each of these flowcharts. So if you're ready, let's walk through them. Let's see. So if you guys will bear with me here, I'm gonna share my screen. And then I'm going to try to kind of mark on the screen here too, and hopefully that'll make some sense to you guys. So what we have here is, how the Texas Child Protective Services system works. We really anticipate this kind of being the go-to, most commonly used flowchart. Really, before we ever get into the weeds, we wanted something that was going to be something higher level. We wanted something that was going to be more of a process versus a map. So what we really wanted to show were kind of the main steps. And so you kind of see this flowchart is done kind of in 6 steps. There's kind of 6 different sections here in a way. And so then we wanted, within that, we wanted to be able to say like, okay, there's 6 main steps, but then point you to the different flowcharts for more information. So that's how this one is set up. So let's kind of walk through this one. So we have this first, try to kind of walk you along here. So this first one is where, a report comes in. And this comes into statewide intake. Just for reference, there are in 2019, there were 294,739 reports coming into statewide intake. And then what you kind of go to next is this next step, and what we kind of call like a screening in, screening out process. And what determines what's screened in versus screened out is whether or not it meets the definition. So the allegation of abuse or neglect, whether or not it meets the definition in the Texas Family Code of abuse or neglect or exploitation. And where you can find this in the Texas Family Code is in Chapter 261. We also have some materials on our website. It's under the child abuse facts on our website, and it kind of summarizes what those definitions are if you want to check that out as well. But ultimately here, what happens is a case can either be, the report can either be screened out. And in those situations, basically you're referred to services in the community. That happens about 41% of the time. Or basically the case is funneled further into the system. Then you have the next step in this process, kind of the next process. It's, a case is assigned a priority right here. So basically what happens in this, it's, what's determined is the severity of the possible harm and how immediate the risk is to the child. There's kind of 3 different categories here. And again, they're all based on the severity of risk. And so you have the highest priority, which is the priority 1. And then there's the priority 2, and then the priority none. Priority 1s happen about 20% of the time. Priority 2, about 62%, and priority none, it's about 18% of the reports. So then the next step, again, based on severity, what will happen next is whether or not the case is routed to investigations or alternative response. And so the main takeaway here is a higher priority case. So where there is more severe risk goes to investigations. If it's lower risk, it goes to alternative response. 69% of the reports from statewide intake go to investigations. About 14% go to alternative response. The rest of those cases that end up with a priority none designation end up being closed out. Then we have this kind of next step in the process. So really what happens here is basically what happens is there's further need for services. Further intervention is necessary. So you can either go to family-based safety services, which is down here. And so in 2019, 18,067 completed investigations were referred to family-based safety services. And that's basically where, again, further intervention is necessary. There's additional services provided to the family. Or in about 18,615 of those cases, there were removals. And this is where a whole legal process happens in conservatorship. Then you have this kind of final step. And these are kind of main outcomes that happen after, this legal process. This is not an exhaustive list. But, you know, it's where the case is, you know, working towards reunification or possible adoption, things like that. Within this chart, again, you heard me say that, you know, this is kind of a high level, but there are some nuances. For instance, a case can go in between alternative response and investigations, or it can go from family-based safety services or be sent, you know, potentially for removal to conservatorship. But again, this chart isn't really meant to reflect all those little bitty details. So for more details, we go into those other flowcharts. So we'll go ahead and skip over to the next one. So before we really kind of get into the process, there's something that I want to show you guys. So there's this legend up here. Again, kind of get up here and show this upper right hand corner. This shows up on each of our stages of service in the flow charts. So there's this plus sign, and you'll see it, you know, it comes up in various places in each of the flow charts. But what it does is it's meant to point you to more information. So you guys in this webinar are only seeing kind of the front of these flow charts, but there actually is a back or a second page, and I'll show you kind of a glimpse of that. But what it's meant to do is get you more information, you know, into each of those processes, and each one has some different information. For instance, in this investigation, we go more into detail about what the investigative process looks like. We talk more about what's in the safety and risk assessments, and we even talk about, you know, kind of what that frequency looks like in some of the other ones. But again, each one of these kind of goes into some different information, but I wanted to at least kind of show you that those are going to kind of pop up. So I want you guys to be familiar with that. Then we also have, up here, you know, you see that the case is assigned. There's got some little people right here. I want to show you what that kind of looks like in some of these charts. Probably the most common place, and you might see them at the end, but they're definitely throughout different places. But what it is like any time in a flow chart where it's being assigned to a different stage of service. So here, for instance, in the investigation, if there's need for further services with the family to keep the child safe, they would be referred to family-based safety services. So it's generally these little people are normally attached to a little yellow box that will show you which case or which stage of service that they go to. Then the other little sign that you'll see in the legend is the stop sign right here. So this basically indicates when a case can be closed. You'll see them a little maroon box in the different flow charts. It's anytime a case can be closed. It's basically saying stop. This is where CPS can get out for different reasons, and we try to clarify that in each of the flow charts, the different reasons a case can be closed. So that's what all can be found in the legend. The other thing that I do want to point out to you guys that you will see commonly in these flow charts are these green circles. Sorry guys, I can't draw a circle, but you get the gist here. So you've got, each of these circles has a question. And what it's meant to be is kind of a decision point to say, okay, depending on how you answer this question is where the rest of this flow chart is going to go. So for instance, you know, this question is saying, okay, is there high or very high level of risk? Because if there's not, then, you know, you typically can kind of work your way out of a case. But if there is, then, you know, there's going to be different outcomes. So, you know, the yes or the no is how you flow throughout these flow charts. So again, that's just wanted to make sure you guys were aware that that's kind of why these are in there, and again, kind of shows the flow through these flow charts. All right, so let me clear that for you guys, and we'll keep talking about them. So now that we've talked about that, let's go ahead and jump in here. So before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of an investigation, I'd be remiss to not talk a little bit more about statewide intake. You heard me talk about it kind of in that overview flow chart, the one we talked about prior to this. So we kind of talk about this being like the front end of the system, that kind of that front door. You know, most people kind of have the most questions there. They want to know, like, well, what happens whenever I call in a report? How does it make its way through? You know, how do we even, like, where do we start? How does it end up in the hands of an investigator? That kind of thing. And the reality is a statewide intake really does determine the trajectory of a case, really does determine what happens to a family. And so the first that you saw is just, again, that screen in, screen out process. That's where you heard me talk about 41% of the cases, you know, get referred to community services. And so they don't even make it further in, but the rest of the cases continue to move forward. And then that second key step, which is kind of reflected here in this process, in between all of this, is that where a case is assigned a priority. And so in all of this, you know, determines where a case goes. So if you kind of remember me talking about, it's determined by whether a case is, you know, if there's high risk or lower risk. And so in this situation, we're talking about the, you know, how an investigation works. So if there is a high level of risk, you know, it's going to be routed the traditional investigation route. And again, that happens in 69% of cases that get called into statewide intake. So when I was doing all my research on this, you know, and also just kind of thinking through my own experience with the department, I was just really thinking about how thorough an investigation is. Just thinking about all the interviews that are done, the comprehensive background checks between like criminal histories, CPS histories, things like that. You know, and all of that's really done to obviously figure out, you know, to substantiate or not substantiate the allegation, but also it's to figure out if the child is safe now and if the child can be safe in the future. And so at the end of the investigation, you know, what they're trying to figure out is a disposition. And so this is where this is kind of landing us here on this flow chart. And so a disposition is basically a fancy way of answering the question, is it likely that the allegation of abuse or neglect occurred? And so there's 5 different dispositions that the department can arrive at. And so there's reason to believe, and it's kind of adequately named. So it's reason to believe that abuse or neglect occurred. There's ruled out, which basically says abuse or neglect didn't occur. And then there's unable to determine, which is saying that there's not enough evidence to conclude that abuse or neglect occurred. Then there's unable to complete. And basically what falls into this category is if a family moved, if a family is unable to locate, or if a family didn't cooperate before an investigation could be concluded. And then the last category is administrative closure, which basically says there's no longer grounds for an investigation. And then by the end of an investigation, really the goal is child safety. And so when you're trying to figure out how you can close a case, which is really everything kind of after here, right? You're trying to figure out if, you know, a child can, you know, remain in the home safely, if CPS can get out of the case or things like that. There's different scenarios. So right here you have, you know, can CPS get out so the child is in the home, can remain safe? But then there's also these other scenarios that can happen. And so I'm just going to kind of highlight a couple of them. So the perpetrator can be, you know, asked to leave the home. But in those scenarios, there would be further intervention necessary with the department. And so, you know, you could potentially refer the family to family-based safety services for further intervention, for further supports to ensure child safety. And we'll talk a little bit more about family-based safety services later. Or there's obviously the removal process if it reaches that threshold, which is what this is referring to. And again, we'll talk about that process later. All right, and now we will move on to alternative response. Go ahead and clear my drawings. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with alternative response, it's actually adequately named. It is the alternative response to a traditional investigation. The difference is in how a case is handled. So I want to kind of point out a couple of those things. So there is no final case disposition. That's one of them. The second is there's no designation of a perpetrator of abuse or neglect. And third, there is no one added to the central registry as a result of the intervention. But another difference that I definitely want you guys to hear about, and you heard me kind of allude to this earlier, is the type of case that is sent to an alternative response process. And that is a case that is lower risk. So again, you heard me talk about how investigations, they handle those P1s and some P2s that have that higher risk. Well, alternative response is working with cases that are lower risk. And the goal in alternative response is child safety and well-being. To meet this goal, they typically work with a family for up to 60 days. Sometimes there can be a 20-day extension granted. I will say this, it is really clear in all the handbook materials and things that to get a 20-day extension, it really has to be necessary and helpful for the family. And in all of this, you will see, it talks a lot about collaborative, work with the family, they co-create the family plan, things like that. There's just, when the caseworker is working with the family, they're helping provide services and supports, and they really want to make sure that this is successful. And like with an investigation, they are constantly assessing risk and safety are at the forefront of every decision that is made. So at the end of this, which really is where this kind of question comes in, as we're kind of approaching that 60-day mark, that time limit's kind of expiring, a decision has to be made about whether or not further intervention is necessary. So maybe in this scenario, the 60 days was enough. And so CPS can say, okay, we're getting out of the picture here. Everything's fine. The child is safe. We're going to keep the child in the home. We don't really feel like any sort of intervention is necessary at this point. They could look at the 20-day extension. They could say, okay, we only need 20 more days and we really feel like we can get out successfully. Or they could look at the possibility of, possibly there's some safety issues and they need to work towards removal. But there's kind of this middle ground. Maybe there's not, they haven't quite met the threshold saying that the child needs to be removed or to even start that process. But maybe more than 20 days is needed to really work with this family and to be able to say the child will be safe in this home if we get out of the picture. So in those scenarios, family-based safety services is an option. And so this is where they would refer the family to family-based safety services. And so we'll talk about that next. Okay, so family-based safety services, also known as FBSS for short. This is really where, once families have either gone through an investigation or possibly the alternative response process, and it's been determined that further intervention is necessary to keep the child safe. So they've said, okay, additional services are needed. There's more supports that are needed for this family. And so it's been determined that really working with this family for a longer period of time would be necessary. Also, it should be noted that CPS really talks about the delivery of these services being child safety centered and family focused. And so another thing I do want to point out too, and it kind of talks about that here, is there could be a scenario with family-based safety services where the child could be in the home or they may be placed outside of the home. But really what determines that is whether or not it's safe for the child to be in the home. And so obviously the department is assessing for what that scenario needs to look like. But during this whole process, you see that the caseworker is working with the family, trying to get them into services. that address the reasons why the department is involved. It's, again, very collaborative. They're assessing for safety and risk throughout the entire case. Safety and risk are at the forefront of every decision that is made. I know I'm sounding a little bit like a broken record on that one, but it is true. And you also see where, you know, again, because it's pretty intensive with how they're working with the family. Also, these risk and safety assessments determine how often they're making visits with the family, because again, if there's higher risk, they want to make sure that there's more eyes on the family, making sure that there's more services in place, those kinds of things. So as the caseworker works, you know, through the case, you kind of see some similar things kind of are now becoming common in a lot of these flow charts. Is, okay, well, what happens whenever we get to the end of a case where we really need to determine, okay, can the department get out of the case, or do we need to intervene further? So in these scenarios, you may see where, okay, now we've got, we've worked with the family, they've really been able to mitigate the concerns that got us involved, we can close the case. But if there is further intervention that's necessary, there's actually two scenarios with FBSS that could occur. So FBSS is actually a voluntary program. There's nothing really mandating that a family participate with FBSS. In an FBSS case, there is no legal custody or anything like that. But a family could be court ordered to participate in court-ordered services. So that's different than the removal and legal process, but it is that kind of next step. And so that is a possibility, or the next is if that is, if there has been a threshold that's been met where the child is unsafe, a removal process could be started. And that is where this part comes in, and we will start talking about that next. All right. So I'm actually going to have you guys participate with the raise your hand function again. If you guys could just participate with me one more time. So that function down at the bottom of your screen where it said the raise your hand. So before today, had any of you heard of the word conservatorship and you knew what it meant? Quite a few of you. Okay, so you guys are on the ball here. Okay, but I do see that there's some that there's not all raised hands, but there's quite a few raised hands. Okay, so this one's a little bit more split here. Okay. Thanks for participating and humoring me in that one. So I don't know if you guys know, but it's always annoying to me. Every time you type the word conservatorship in Word, Microsoft Word, it underlines it. It doesn't even like the word. So conservatorship, for those of you that don't know, it is a legal term that means custody. But also it is the stage of service for the department whenever the family is working with the department and a child is in state custody. Also, you will see in this flow chart, we use, and the department uses CPS for short for conservatorship. Also, another term that's kind of used interchangeably with this stage of service is substitute care. So I do want to go ahead and address that as well. So substitute care basically is alternative placement away from home. That's probably the simplest way to kind of talk about that. That can be placement with a kinship caregiver. It could be foster care. It could be emergency shelter. It could be a residential treatment center. But basically, it just means placement away from home. And you'll often hear, even in the department's materials, it's just, it is talked about kind of interchangeably. And so I just wanted to go ahead and address that up front. So a goal for substitute care is to keep a child safe from abuse or neglect. So once that once they have been removed from the home, the goal is to keep them safe from abuse or neglect. But also to ensure that their needs are being met the needs of safety, well-being, and permanency. And then also the department is working with the family to mitigate the concerns that got them involved in the first place. And so they do this by providing services to the family and supports to the family. So it's it's a very interactive stage of service. As you can see, there's a lot of moving pieces. And for anyone that has spent some time working in this, there's court involvement, there's a lot going on within the department. So, it's just, there's just a lot to take into consideration here. But there's definitely, working with the family and working with the child simultaneously, there's a lot of moving pieces. And so there's a couple of things I did want to point out though, kind of right here at the beginning. Let's see. Well, so you can see that there's a few ways for the department to seek custody. I'm not really going to get super detailed about this, but because we're talking about court timelines, and you'll definitely hear about this if you're working in this field, that there's emergency removals and there's not emergency removals. The main thing that I do want you to hear though is that emergency removals are really what happens most. Also want you to be aware that once the department has custody, once that happens, you have 365 days really to seek a resolution, to reach a resolution. So just wanted to kind of highlight those few things up front. So you heard me kind of talk about how, again, there's a lot of moving pieces. You're working with family, you're working with the child, and all these different things. So generally speaking, the child is, the preference is that they are in a least restrictive family-like setting. It's preferred that they are placed with family when that is appropriate and available. And so the caseworker is typically visiting with the child at least once a month, and they're ensuring that their needs are met. The caseworker is also visiting with the family at least once a month, and they're making sure that they are set up with services. They're checking in with their providers and things like that to make sure that they are addressing the concerns that got the department involved. And then again, as you see, so that's just kind of what's going on with the department. But then there's also this court process, obviously, since there's, a whole legal part of this. And so you see where there's different hearings that are being involved, and those happen at certain time frames. And so there's a court overseeing this. And so the main thing that I bring that up in talking about how there's kind of this court process and what the department is doing, because there's so many natural check-in points to really check in about progress and to evaluate whether or not the family is alleviating the concerns and to really assess risk and safety. There's the court hearings that are happening. There's permanency hearings and family group conferences and all the different things that are happening with the department. There's also these monthly visits that are happening with the child and the parents. There's just so many different times to really be checking in. And so, there's just so much going on, but there's just, because of all of those check-ins, you're really getting a good picture of what's going on with the family and the progress that's going on. And because of that, hopefully by the end of this case, at some point in this case, you're able to really find out, okay, is this child going to be safe if returned home? And so that is where this kind of comes in, right here. And so the idea is, can this child safely return home? And if the answer to that is yes, the court will enter into a return and monitor. This opens up a six-month period of time where the child, it is what it sounds like, returns home, and CPS monitors that situation with the child in the home. There's a whole new family plan of service done, the strengths and needs of the family are reassessed, there's services put in place, all these things to make sure that it's successful. And so, and if at any point during that 6 months, it's deemed that the department can get out of the picture and that this family is successful, then CPS can go ahead and close out the case. But if at any point during that return and monitor it's deemed that the child is unsafe, the return and monitor will be revoked. And so that's what this is kind of talking about here. And so in that, if the child has to be removed out of that situation, they're placed back into substitute care. Another 6 months is added on to try to continue to work with the family towards reunification. Again, the family, you know, the plan is always to try to continue to work with the family towards reunification. But with that said, I do want to point out that if at any point in a case, whether it's after a returning monitor is revoked, or maybe it is earlier in a case, if it's determined that it's not safe for the child to return home, whatever those various circumstances may be, then an alternative route is considered. And that's what kind of this route right here and kind of this continued route up here is kind of looking at. Probably not the best drawing for you guys, but I think you get kind of where I'm going with that. But basically, what it is you're trying to kind of figure out the best permanent solution for this child if the child can't return home. Because obviously that's the permanent solution that we want for a child if that is a permanent safe solution. But if that is not the safe solution for the child, then we need to find another permanent safe solution. And maybe that looks like adoption. Maybe that looks like custody to a relative. And so, you know, and obviously there's some other options there too, but those are, you know, just some of the examples. So that is kind of, you know, what conservatorship looks like, and they continue, you know, to work towards those permanency goals until those permanency goals are reached. All right. Okay, so now I'm bringing us back. So now that we have gotten kind of more into the details of the others, I'm bringing us back to this original one. And my hope in doing that is that maybe this one now makes a little bit more sense. Maybe now that we have, you know, gone into a little bit more of what those other stages of service looks like and how the department utilizes them, maybe this now kind of shows you how they interact with each other and things like that. And so, yeah, so hopefully this now demystified it a little bit for you. Hopefully it didn't confuse you more. That's definitely not the goal. But anyway, so now what we're going to do is actually open this up for questions, and we'll go from there. So one of the questions on the chat is about basically about community-based care. So in some areas of the state, stage 2 is where case management is, where case management is taken over by these single source continuum contractors. And so it's a specific question about what's happening in Region 3 or the catchment area in Region 3, OCOK. And so for CBS, they have, you know, obviously taken over stage 2 in that area. So that's true for there, but not true in all areas. Stage 2 has also occurred in Region 2, but again, has not happened in all the areas. As far as FBSS, there was a pilot in another area of the state. There's still some discussion about whether or not FBSS is going to fall under community-based care. But so hopefully that has answered your question, but that is an excellent question. The goal obviously is for this to continue kind of rolling out in different regions of the state. There's different readiness plans that are kind of built in. So there's different areas that are in stage 1. And, you know, and obviously if they're able to kind of show that they're ready for stage 2, it can roll out in those areas as well. So it could be a slow rollout, it may be faster in different areas, but there you go. Let's see. So I'm scrolling through. Some of these are actually kind of some similar questions. I'm just trying to. It's a great question about CASA advocates and how they play into this. Well, so I've always said, and I was, again, as a caseworker myself, CASA was always a great, you know, a great advocate alongside caseworkers, and really loved having them to team with us. So where do CASA advocates play into this? You know, obviously in the legal process, you know, they are part of the legal team. They are part of the child's team, you know, that are going into court. They are the ones that, you know, advocate for the kids. So absolutely see them playing into every single piece of the conservatorship flowchart, honestly. You know, they're the ones going into court advocating for what's in the child's best interest. They're the ones that are also making visits. So, you know, we did not specifically add them in, you know, to that specific process. It was really kind of more how the department, you know, because we didn't really necessarily add in the legal advocates, like even the attorneys, but you know, obviously CASA plays a major role in these cases. So we have a question also about how what happens after CPS is given PMC. So let me kind of back up here. I know I didn't really get into this, but obviously you can see it in the flow chart. And let me actually, I'm gonna go back to, I'm gonna share the conservatorship flow chart while I'm answering this question. That might be more helpful for you guys. Okay, so what happens after CPS is given PMC? Okay, so if you kind of see here, when the department is first given custody, it's called temporary managing conservatorship, because again, a resolution is supposed to be reached within 365 days. So it's supposed to be temporary because the parents still have their parental rights. And, you know, the idea is that you're working towards reunification, and you know, ideally that the child would be going home. But obviously there's going to be some cases where that may not happen. And so in these situations, what happens after given PMC, so if the case goes to termination of parental rights or not, in some situations, you know, parental rights are left intact. So a final order is entered into. And so on the flow chart, let me show you where that happens. So the final hearing happens here, but we kind of had to have it kind of floating in space because it can happen at different places. But once PMC is given, then you know, you continue working with the child towards permanency. So maybe the PMC is given to the department, or PMC can be given to the relative. You know, it's also possible in those situations. But in general, the answer is, I'm going to maybe just kind of gear it towards if the department is given PMC, because that means the department stays involved. They continue having permanency hearings. They continue working towards a permanent goal for the child. That could be trying to work, if parental rights have been terminated, it could be trying to find them a forever home. It could be, depending on the age of the child, you know, if they're an older child and they want to, you know, potentially start looking for like supervised independent living kind of options, those kinds of things, it could be that. It could be, if parental rights are intact and they are with a relative, it could be working with them towards permanency care assistance, which kind of gives them similar benefits to adoption, but not adoption. So there are different, you know, different options there. So another question on here is, how are service plans enforced? So that's an interesting question as well. So how are service plans enforced? I would say that, you know, in general, if you're talking about conservatorship, these are generally also entered into with the court. And so sometimes they are court ordered. And so if that is the situation, then I would say, you know, that parents need to follow them because there could be legal ramifications. But obviously, you know, there's also reasonable efforts that are supposed to be, you know, followed with the courts. You know, so obviously trying to help families get into services, and that's going to be really important. You know, so again, it's not necessarily that, you know, it's just like you have to do this, but it's also making sure that you are helping them get into those services and being reasonable about that, and what's actually available, and making sure that you're working towards the goal that, you know, that's meant for that service. The other thing, but obviously like service plans are done in other stages of service. You know, in those stages of service, there isn't necessarily the backing of the court, like an order, so to speak. So really, I would say that enforced isn't really the word I would use. I would just say that what I did as a caseworker, I would say that these are the things that really, you know, the way I would use those with a parent is to say, like, this is what, you know, is going to help, you know, your entire family, and obviously, you know, help in development of you as a parent, and help keep your child safe. So. Right. Trying to read through some of these here, see if any of them have some common things. I can try to answer several. So there's some questions specific to investigation about like who determines the priority, are they supervisors, those kinds of questions. So it's an intake specialist at statewide intake. And so basically from there, they are the ones that review the information, and then they make a determination on the priority. It is then sent to an intake or an investigation screener or an intake screener, and for somebody to be able to review that even more, make sure that those are basically kind of that you're getting the most information. So it's kind of another set of eyes. So basically it's not just going through one person. And so the CPS handbook, actually it said it could be a screener or a supervisor, but from our feedback from the department, it sounded like it was the majority, it was a screener that does that. So it looks like we are right on time here. So I really wanted to just say thank you all for participating. We really hope that you guys will use these resources. We hope that they're useful to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.